making these commitments and mouthing the words 5% doesn't get us there. In Canada's case, we haven't seen the budget. There is no national budget, and we can talk about that further. Where will the money come from?
This is the Expert Series podcast from the CDA Institute, Canada's premier defense and security think tank. I'm Josh Malm, and it's Friday, June 27th, 2025.
The new NATO targets at 5% of GDP, those new NATO targets, are tailored to address new threats and challenges. And the capabilities required to meet this moment have been the driving factors for those targets.
Got a big fight, like two kids in a schoolyard. You know, they fight like hell. You can't stop them. Let them fight for about 2-3 minutes. Then it's easier to stop them.
And then Daddy has to sometimes use strong language to
you have to use strong language. Every once in a while you have to use
At the 76th NATO Summit in The Hague this week, Canada joined its allies in adopting a bold new defense spending pledge, committing to invest 5% of its GDP annually by 2035. Here with us to unpack the takeaways from this year's NATO Summit and Canada's plan to hit 5% of GDP on defense spending, we're once again joined by Peter MacKay, former Minister of National Defence. Peter, thanks so much for joining us once again.
Pleasure to be with you, Josh. Thank you to you and the CDA.
So, big news this week. It was the 76th NATO Summit in The Hague. What were some of the key concerns, challenges, or opportunities going into this year's summit from your perspective? And maybe a second part of that, what do you think were the key takeaways from the communique, particularly for Canada?
Sure. Well, let me take the latter question first. Unlike NATO summits that I've attended over the years, I think it's increasingly obvious that it's challenging to put together a communique that everybody will sign on to, most notably the President of the United States. We saw that happen at the G7. We've seen it previously at meetings, and maybe that's a good thing. These communiques are often very proscribed and sort of prosaic. They don't really, in fact, put out substantial progress reports. It's a lot of flowery language. So in this instance, the big takeaway, to be obvious, was the commitment by all 32 NATO members to aspire to get to 5% by 2035, so 10 years from now. And just to unpack that a little bit, the 2% of GDP spending by Canada was committed to previously by Prime Minister Carney, I think to preempt the criticism that we've seen leveled at Canada in the past. So both in advance of the G7 and this NATO summit, I think Prime Minister Carney wanted to avoid that spectacle and made the commitment. And maybe we can talk about that a little further. But the big takeaway was a recommitment by the expanded NATO, all 32, and the fact that they will hit that 5%, which is a massive increase, an eye-watering increase in terms of GDP dollars from national budgets. And the fact that there wasn't, I guess this is maybe setting a bit of a low bar, but there wasn't any, outburst from a mercurial president who came and left quickly, as he did previously. He was there, I think, less than 24 hours, but essentially said, look, the United States is going to be there for our allies. We're committed to the Article 5 and delighted that everybody is going to up their game in terms of investment in national defense spending.
Well, that's a great scene setter, Peter. Thank you for that. It may be well obvious to you and I why NATO would want to extend the NATO defense spending threshold, but maybe for an audience who is not so versed in these subjects, could we provide some context? Like, what does the push to 5% defense spending imply about the state maybe of international security in 2025? What factors, from your perspective, might be contributing towards this push?
Sure, that's extremely relevant, and the impetus for the increase in spending is multitudes of factors, but most notably the insecure geopolitics that have unfolded in the last 5 years or more. But Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine that really goes back to 2014, when ironically the initial push for 2% GDP spending began at NATO. Obviously, still massive uncertainty in the Middle East. The not only Israel, Hamas, Hezbollah, but now Iran conflict, although that's on a slow boil. Ongoing and very real threats to Taiwan and in the South China Sea by China. That is also a major factor that countries are keeping an eye on. And other parts of the world, terrorism has still not dissipated. Just the general malaise and instability that exists within the security threshold for countries. That urgency has caused countries, including Canada, to look very seriously at how they up their game. Now, more locally here in North America, we have very real ongoing concerns about vulnerability in the Arctic. I dare say, had Russia not got embroiled in a grinding conflict in Ukraine, they would have a much larger presence in the high Arctic and be much more menacing to North America. And we are seeing sort of the limits of their capabilities being tested, but they have nuclear submarines. They have missiles capable of reaching us quite quickly. And they have been recapitalizing airfields and military installations, including launch installations in the high Arctic. So those are all major factors. Canada, of course, participates in the Five Eyes in addition to NATO and NORAD. And so we are very much integrated with the United States in addition to our NATO allies when it comes to the security assessment and what's required. And I'll just end with, we have, and it pains me to say this, Josh, but we have allowed our military capability to deteriorate significantly over the last decade in both equipment, personnel, and most notably in readiness. And so the commitments are welcome. The prioritization is needed. Now it's time to deliver. And that's where I think there is some skepticism from those that I've spoken to.
And we'll certainly get into capabilities and the need to deliver momentarily. Before we do that, I was hoping to ask one more kind of summit-related question. There were concerns going into the summit regarding American engagement, potential retrenchment. And as you said, Trump's sort of, if we want to say mercurial nature, kind of creates uncertainties as well for any kind of large-scale event with global leaders like this. Earlier in the year, we had the Vice President Vance's Munich speech, which was quite notable. We've had a couple of other instances since then. How do you interpret the health of the transatlantic partnership right now vis-a-vis the Americans and Europe following the summits? Or does it look like not much is really changing?
Well, I think it's marginally improved because of this summit and the commitments that were made. But as my Irish grandmother used to say, there's many a slip between the cup and the lip. Making these commitments and mouthing the words 5% doesn't get us there. In Canada's case, we haven't seen the budget. There is no national budget. And we can talk about that further. Where will the money come from? And I think that's true of many countries, quite frankly. And some have already expressed, even, hours after committing to 5%, some, I wouldn't call it reticence, but reluctance to say that they were actually going to be able to get there within the allotted time. As far as the relationship's concerned, and I hesitate to say this, but the president is and has quite deliberately created a tremendous amount of uncertainty on trade, on security, on relationships generally. So people are feeling like they're walking a bit on thin ice every time there's an encounter of this nature with the president. We saw the dressing down of President Zelensky in the White House. They did meet while at the Hague. That's a good thing, as were some of the utterances, the spontaneous utterances by the president, both on the flight over, at the conference, and on the way back, that are expressing perhaps a little bit more real world, clear-eyed understanding of Russia and what they've done and continue to do to Ukraine and what a cold-blooded, tyrannical liar we have in Vladimir Putin. And so those are all accumulated a good sign, but they don't put the alliance on completely solid ground. And I'll use this expression, it's show me. I think a lot of the populace and those who follow security matters, those who are serving, they're saying, show me. We're encouraged. We want to be optimistic, but there's still a reticence that this is actually going to happen.
So Canada's new defense commitments significantly increase the current level of investment in defense, Peter. I believe most of the funding, 3.5% or something, is going to core capabilities, and then 1.5 can go to infrastructure. I believe that was the kind of basic breakdown that was articulated. So how feasible is it for Canada to reach this new 5% target when we haven't yet hit 2%? And where could that money go? And what are the challenges in delivering?
Yeah, that's this quintessential question. I mean, the expression, sort of the undertone of the summit itself was stronger, fairer, more lethal, which, as you've unpacked it, the 3.5% on actual military capability, 1.5 on infrastructure, going from 2% to 5% over the next 10 years. That's a massive, dollar commitment. And behind that, and perhaps of even greater concern, if the money is there, is the ability to push that kind of money through the bureaucracy. I can tell you, based on experience, even in the midst of prosecuting the war in Afghanistan, our government was throwing huge dollar commitments, budgetary commitments from Finance Minister Flaherty, the Prime Minister Harper, all in, very committed. And it was a complicated process, is procurement. Broken, some would say. And yet we were able, in many cases because of the force of our relationship with the United States, to get major muscle movements on things like heavy lift, Hercules and Globemaster aircraft. We were able to procure an entire fleet of Chinook heavy lift helicopters, M777 howitzer guns. We purchased through a very unique purchase and sale agreement with the Netherlands, what they call Leopard 2 tanks. So heavy armor, all of those things happened not because, the bureaucracy went about the same approach that they would take to buying photocopiers, but we were able to do these things because of personal relationships that I and others had developed with other countries and other ministers and other leadership within those countries. I find it very hard, frankly, to believe that we're going to be able to, for example, make all of these purchases happen within the next 6 months, let alone the next 10 years. It's possible, it's feasible, but something is going to have to get fixed within the bureaucracy of Canada and other countries in order for that to happen. And the last thing I'll say is that you have this cross-threading of mandates. National Defense, of course, wants new equipment as soon as possible, a sense of urgency there. And then you have Public Works that want to design the perfect contract, not really possible. Then you have Industry Canada wanting every nut and bolt and washer made inside Canada. You have the oversight, as you would expect, of Treasury Board and other departments that sometimes play into this. So Prime Minister Carney has talked about a new Department of Procurement. That'll take time, a year or more to stand up. All of this is going to create headwinds in terms of making these type of investments happen. And as I said, the overriding question is the money there? Where is it going to come from? Is it cuts generating new wealth, or is it further debt?
I'm wondering if you might be able to unpack a little bit more some of the institutional reforms that might be required within, say, D&D or the CAF to maybe ensure that some of these increases in defense funding can translate to measurable increases in readiness and capability.
Yes, they've been given a clear signal that the Prime Minister wants this to happen, and he wants it to happen quickly. So it's the proverbial all hands on deck. I fear Parliament is going to recess very soon, and it goes into this sort of malaise of summertime slowdown, then comes back with the force in the fall, and then you got 4 months to hit the 2%. Now, some of that spending is already has been outlined. They're bringing Coast Guard into the fold of national defense. That's over $2.5 billion. You're going to see increases in salaries and increases, hopefully, in the recruitment, because we're down about 14 or 15,000 regular force members currently. That would be job one, in my opinion. And then you'll have other expenditures that are long overdue, investments in housing, for example, in supports more broadly for military and their families. So you can see how the money that should be in the pipeline now may get us to that elusive 2% by Christmas or slightly after. The longer term plan that you're asking about will require, I think, institutional reform, possibly even legislative reform, to bring together, under this new procurement department. And we've seen it work in other countries. In fact, even non-NATO countries like Australia have been able to bring together specific military procurement focus and intense focus on moving these contracts forward. Still having sufficient oversight, still having the sufficient legislative cover to get the money out the door. We have in Canada, of course, a parliamentary budget office. We have the Auditor General. We have a military ombudsman. We have a number of other safeguards built into the system. But that can also slow things down. And then you have, the other reality, Josh, is that this is a minority government. And so there's going to have to be some, opposition support and opposition consultation, to be sure. All of that takes time. But hopefully there is a recognition of the massive urgency that we spoke of earlier because of geopolitical conditions, including, facing us here in North America. We have, adversaries coming increasingly close to our shores. I spoke about the Arctic. There will be intense pressure by the United States. There is all of these interlocking issues around trade and tariffs that, are working and bubbling their way through our system and our relationship with the United States. Big ticket items and discussions around this Golden Dome, Arctic defense, missile defense. I think the Canadian public, though, are out in front of it and are quite prepared to support these type of initiatives if they're done responsibly and transparently.
Peter, you, of course, were a long-serving, the Minister of National Defense. Let's say you were in the shoes of the current defense minister. You're now told by your NATO allies that they want you to get to 5%. I'm wondering, based on your experiences and interactions with different parties and actors in the defense sphere as defense minister, what is maybe a challenge that the general public or even maybe pundits don't understand about maybe some of the difficulties inherent in increasing that defense spending? Canada often criticizes itself rightly in many aspects for not spending enough on defense. But what, from your boots on the ground kind of experience, what is something that might be misunderstood about trying to get to a goal like that?
Well, just the sheer numbers and the amount of revenue that will have to be generated through increasing our economic activity. So if you have top cover from the Prime Minister, which apparently Minister McGuinty does, the first thing I would do is either at Cabinet or directly with the Minister of Natural Resources and other economic ministers talk about how we're going to grow our economy to pay for this. And to use the vernacular and the expression perhaps not so politically correct with the president, it's drill, baby, drill. If we don't get back in the game in terms of our natural resources, and export of those resources to new markets, but also increasing that cross-border flow of critical minerals, of oil and gas, of liquefied natural gas. That is really the quickest and most sensible and most efficient way to see prosperity and growth in the Canadian economy. Keeping in mind that the percentage of GDP spending as your prosperity and growth goes up, that accelerates your ability to put money into national defense. But it's also, of course, and not to get too into the weeds, but there's pressures on so many other files as well. Healthcare, working with the provinces on transportation infrastructure. The Prime Minister has spoken about national infrastructure projects. So all of these competing interests. But if you're the Minister of National Defense and you're told to go out and start beating the bushes in terms of getting your own bureaucracy in line, securing contracts, I mean, I can't help but point to the challenges that we, Canada, multiple governments have had to procure fifth-generation fighter aircraft. I mean, I still have the scars from that jarring experience, that started, quite frankly, back in the late 90s. And we've been 25 years trying to buy this fifth-generation stealth aircraft, mainly because of political posturing. And we saw that pumping of the brakes on Sea King replacement as well. Even after years in politics and some time now in the private sector, I still, perhaps naively, believe that national security should take precedence. And, photocopiers shouldn't go through the same procurement process as fighter aircraft. So that's a long answer. And there's a bunch of moving parts, I think, to getting to that higher threshold, 2%, ultimately 5%. But it will take a Herculean effort on the part of this government and future governments, because they're talking about a 10-year window.
Another notable outcome of the past few days, ahead of the summit, there was talk about Canada joining the Rearm Europe initiative or potentially having a place in that. We saw the EU-Canada summit happen just before the NATO summit, where I believe EU and Canada agreed to strengthening a defense and security partnership. Peter, I'm wondering if you might be able to kind of quickly maybe tease out some of the potential implications of that, and maybe touch on how this attempts to diversify towards Europe impacts the Canada-US bilateral relationship on defense, if at all.
Yeah, that's a fine line for the government and the Prime Minister specifically to walk. And there's been some political posturing. Obviously, this whole elbows up nonsense was electioneering and a slogan that evaporated like the spring snow when the election was over. And then it was, let's talk Golden Dome and let's get back on track with our F-35 procurement. But, having other markets, other options, working closer with the Europeans, which I think the Prime Minister is inclined to do, I don't see that as all bad. I think it also, it has to be a two-way relationship. We, Canada, also have to be able to sell goods, perhaps critical minerals and liquefied natural gas, agriculture products and other things, with the expectation that we may purchase some of their military hardware that's being produced in countries like Germany and France and others. And even within this Liberal government of the last 10 years, they've done that. They bought Airbus products for fixed-wing search and rescue. So, and previous governments have bought marine things like submarines from the UK. All of that is sets a precedent. But to your question, we cannot afford to wrong-foot the Americans when it comes to our highly integrated and critically important relationship around the defense of North America. So NORAD, future discussions on missile defense for the Arctic. We know this president is easily offended and is thin-skinned, so it has to be massaged carefully, this relationship and what is said as far as working closer with the Europeans doesn't mean abandoning or damaging that Canada-US relationship. I think that's critically important.
Now, a couple weeks ago, ahead of the summit, as you know, Prime Minister Carney made the announcement that Canada would be reaching to 2%. And hopefully you got a chance to listen to the speech, but as someone trying to neutrally sort of observe it, I interpreted that, in some ways it seems Mr. Carney had at least articulated a kind of clear-eyed view of the international security environment in some ways, and made it sound as though, this is the moment that Canada has to meet this moment and reach 2%. This of course came a couple of weeks before the summit. Was that speech maybe just a bit on the rhetorical side? Was it kind of strategic, given the lead up to the NATO summit, knowing what we know now, that there's a new defense spending floor? Canada can quickly catch up to 2%, or at least show that it plans to. Or do you think that maybe this is a moment where Canada does start contributing more, realizes the precarity of the international security environment, and tries to be maybe a more proactive NATO partner? Or is it that maybe, we make the speech, we pledge 2% and more again, and then we fall back into kind of some of our typical behaviors with defense spending? What do you think?
Well, I think, like you, Josh, and many others, I want to be optimistic. I want to believe that speech was sincere and came from a good place, and wasn't, politics or rhetoric, as you said. And I think that people are watching much closer than ever before. There is a shorter attention span when it comes to real progress. And I think if this doesn't start to show traction within a relatively short time, there could be a lot of blowback from Canadians, but also from allies, and most notably from the United States. I think the Secretary General of NATO will also be riding herd on countries like Canada. We're in the bottom 5 of 32 right now in terms of actual military spending, as you said. And even the, roughly 10 billion more that we have to get into the Department of National Defense by Christmas will be challenging. But it's feasible. As I said before, all of this is possible. And the good news is it has happened before. We as a conservative government put a lot of money into defense. The impetus, of course, was what was happening in Afghanistan, but other missions as well, and the demonstrable need that the Canadian forces were requiring those type of investments. We had good leadership within the Canadian forces from people like General Hillier and Atinchik, Lawson, others. And, because, I hate to put it so bluntly, there was a war, there was just a very real vibrancy and reality that was happening that required it. And Canadians quickly responded in very spontaneous and very authentic ways. The Highway of Heroes, the sobering, visuals of flag-draped coffins coming off the back of a Herc aircraft at CFB Trenton, that really awakened Canadians in a way that I've never seen. The geopolitics and being inundated in the nightly news of conflicts around us, and in the impact that's having on people, I think has primed the pump for our population to be responsive and supportive and demanding of the government to make these investments. And so, it's a well-worn cliche, but time will tell. We will see in relatively short order whether we're going to have these type of actual investments, procurements, things you could touch and see and feel when it comes to the Canadian Armed Forces. And they need it. They badly need it. None of this is a reflection on them as, our best citizens, our patriotic, serving men and women. And we need more of them. And, these are related issues. If they see those investments and new equipment coming, more Canadians will want to join. They'll want to be part of that. They'll want to feel that pride and purpose that has been a part of our history. But talking about Vimy Ridge and what we did at D-Day and Normandy, that's important to for context, as is Afghanistan, I suppose, in the rear window. But we really need to recognize the current dilemma of not having a combat-ready, deployable Canadian Department of National Defense, or the CAF, as you put it, we need to up our game significantly in short order.
Peter, few people in the country know the defense file as well as you, given your time as defense minister for so long. I consider myself lucky, and I think our audience is lucky as well, to get to listen to your insights for the last half an hour here. So I want to thank you for being so generous with your time today. Thank you for making time again to come on the CDA podcast. And thanks for everything you have done and continue to do to spread knowledge and thought leadership about Canada's important defense issues. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Josh. I've enjoyed it and appreciate what you and the CDA do to put a spotlight on these important security issues.
And that's all for today's episode. You can tune in to the Expert Series every week. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates on Canadian defense and international security. If you have comments or feedback about what you heard in today's edition, email josh@cdainstitute.ca. I'm Josh Malm. Until next time.